Hi, everyone, and welcome to Marketplace Masters, the podcast where we dive deep into the strategies that help Amazon agencies and brand leaders move the needle. I'm your host, Paul Sonneveld, and today we're tackling a big strategic question for US Amazon brands. Is Europe still a nice to have, or has it become a must have, particularly in the context of all the tariff announcements that we've seen over the last 6 months or so? Now, before we jump into today's session, I do have two quick announcements. The first one is to do with our Amazon Vendor Summit. Let me just make sure I can bring that up. I can't. Let's have a look. Here we go. Our Amazon Vendor Summit is coming up on the 9th and 10th of December. It's a two-day virtual event featuring over 15 speakers and 1,000 attendees. Early bird registration is now open. Just scan the QR code on your screen to grab that free ticket. It's complimentary for all vendors and Merchant Spring clients, so make sure you don't miss out. Secondly, quick announcement about Amazon Unboxed. Luke and I will be heading to Nashville in early November, and we'd love to connect with as many of you as possible while we're out there. So if you're attending, just drop me a quick message on LinkedIn. I'd love to catch up in person. So let's move on to today's topic. Today, I am joined by Mark Miller and Jake Russell from Mercatus, one of the largest UK Amazon agencies. With US tariffs tightening margins and Europe's Amazon network maturing quickly, there has never been a better time to talk about what expansion across the Atlantic really looks like. This is a live session, so as per usual, please jump into the LinkedIn comment section or the YouTube comments throughout the session, and I'll make sure we'll get to your questions and put them in front of Mark and Jake. Without further ado, Mark and Jake, welcome to the show today.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having us.
All right, let's jump straight in. Let's start with tariffs, right? That's probably what everyone's thinking. Maybe we'll start with you, Jake. Tell us, why are tariffs acting as such a strong forcing function for Amazon brands right now?
Yeah, so this is the hot topic of the moment, as you say. So for us, the conversations we're having with US brands is just around uncertainty. So uncertainty about what the future is going to look like from a tariff perspective and how that is going to impact your P&L. So it's seemingly things are changing every couple of days at the moment. If you tune into the news at the weekend, Trump was announcing new retaliatory tariffs against China because of these rare mineral export controls that they'd put in place. So it's making it very difficult, obviously, for brands to plan ahead. These additional rates are already stacking on top of tariffs that are already in place. So it's kind of putting things into a position where it's effectively wiping out people's Amazon margin. Margins are not amazing on Amazon in a lot of contexts anyway. So having the pressure of additional tariffs put on top of that is going to kill things. So you don't have to go into a super detailed explanation of the tariffs to understand that. If you already had a 30% rate, there's talk of a 100% rate going on top of that from November the 1st. If you've got $10 landed cost, you've got $13 worth of tariff before you even do anything else. So it's a problem for brands. But when you look at the EU, a lot of the HS codes for popular Amazon products that are coming into the EU are at 0 or say 6%. And with Amazon's AGL, Amazon Global Logistics Network now, it means it's really easy to actually just completely circumvent your sort of home territory and bring stuff straight from China or wherever you're producing into Europe. So it's not just a sort of new opportunity in terms of like market reach. It's a chance to potentially just have a bit more certainty around actually what your margin is going to look like.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk a little bit more about logistics. I mentioned it in my intro, and I was going to ask you, Mark. Amazon has made and US brands may not be aware of this, right? But Amazon has made big investments in its logistics infrastructure in Europe, making it much easier. What are some of the big changes in terms of Amazon's infrastructure evolution that you've seen in Europe and that US brands should be aware of?
Yeah, I think you're right. Certainly over the last few years, and it's not massively utilized in Europe at the moment. But their advancements mean that they're now connecting those Asian manufacturing hubs directly into Amazon's network, in a seamless interface on the seller side. More to the point, you can ship. You don't have to be shipping huge quantities as one might initially think. You can now ship less than container loads, so small parcel shipments into Europe as well. So obviously with those advancements, plus the fact that the network has become more connected, there's more marketplaces that have come on board across Europe in the past 5 years. They've got denser fulfillment center coverage. That combined makes it very accessible and relatively seamless. I don't want to use the word easy ever, but relatively seamless sort of door-to-door solution for a brand situated in the US, manufacturing their product in Asia. There is a route into that market. Coupled with the fact that now it was announced, I think a few days ago. So the latest European territory to come on board was Ireland earlier this year. Belgium preceded that a couple of years ago, but they've just announced a $1 billion investment into Belgium, which will further densify that capacity and accelerate local delivery throughout that network and to each of those locales. So yeah, it seems like a sure bet. Certainly Amazon are putting a lot of effort into facilitating this, and coupled with how this conversation started, Europe is a huge market, 450 million consumers. It's in its growth phase, and Amazon are investing heavily to continue to deepen that network and provide solutions for the consumer.
So that sounds, Mark, like Amazon has they're really taken that sort of the excuse around the logistics network, or it's been too hard to get products over there. They've really invested heavily to take that barrier away. But I was going to ask you, Jake, what are the others? In what biggest sort of what misconceptions or barriers do you still encounter from US brands as you're talking to them about expanding into Europe? I mean, what are the other obstacles that tend to come in the way? Are there real obstacles or perceived obstacles?
So there's definitely a lot of perceived obstacles, but I don't think they really stack up when you look at them. So the one that always jumps out to me is that the US sellers think like Europe is too small to matter, which, as Matt just mentioned, there's 450 million consumers here. It's a massive market, and there's a lot of interesting category asymmetries that exist relative to the US that actually potentially, if you do your research, might make it a lot more interesting than you actually think. So because of country level nuances, particular product categories are really big here. So pets, if you look at France and Germany, is really huge. So we were looking last week as a sort of interesting point. The sixth most searched term on Amazon France was a term for a cat scratch poll sort of thing. Now, it's huge. There's 30% of people in France own cats. So when you look at these little nuances like this, as a whole network on the sort of macro level, it's a big market. But actually, when you break down into the categories, some of these categories can be really huge relative to the US because of just the cultural differences. Another one, France and Spain, there's a big stationary culture there. They it's something like top 5 most searched things around this time of year is a physical calendar planners for writing on paper because they plan on paper. So it's things like that where maybe people may write it off as a not particularly big opportunity for them. It's worth going to do the research to see actually what is the volume in my category, because they may be surprised. Other things I think then is like, kind of in that vein, is treating it as one marketplace. So thinking that Europe is Europe, like we're going to do the same thing everywhere. But it's not the case. So like I say, these are very different countries with very, very different cultural norms, who shop in slightly different ways, want to buy different things at different times of the year. So you have to be going in and looking at like country specific research. So doing your country specific keyword research, obviously, because it's a different language in every one of those, but like looking at like local seasonality planning, looking at what particular holidays, like as I mentioned, like this sort of back to school periods and things like that. But like really understanding each of the marketplaces and having a strategy for each one of those. Yeah, and then included in that, like, it's just an important point that we make is the UK is not part of that anymore as well. So obviously we've spent 10 plus years or something like that arguing about Brexit, so we're no longer part of the EU, unfortunately. So but a lot of US brands sometimes think that we still got that connection, but sadly not. So yeah, I think that's one of them. The other thing, again, just to go back to Mark's point, is thinking about it has to be a big operational headache. You need a 3PL here, you need boots on the ground, etc. But to the point that Mark's just made, the system that are in place now, pan-EU AGL, you don't need that. You can have Amazon sort of burden a lot of that.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask Mark a little bit more about that, because I think there used to be a perception when the UK was still part of, pre-Brexit, everything was easier. You put your inventory in the UK, you saw the rest of Europe. But practically speaking, again, let's take a US Amazon brands perspective. How does the pan-EU FBA network work in practice?
Yeah,
particularly with the Brexit now, and
yeah,
what are some advantages there?
It certainly was easier when the UK was part of pan EU. We've all suffered because of that. Certainly UK sellers, but effectively, you're talking about one large network across many countries. The way that pan EU works, it facilitates the inbounding of product shipment into one locale. The stock will be stored initially in that fulfillment center of choice. And once your product is enrolled into the program and will get onto the requirements for enrollment, Amazon will automatically place your stock across that network in all their fulfillment centers, based on where those orders are happening and where they're seeing demand signals for your product. So the consumers sort of see a local delivery and get that local delivery promise. You as the seller benefit from the local FBA rates if you're in Spain, France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, etc., where the unit ships from. So yeah, it's treated as one stock pool. Obviously, as your progress matures, there's conversations with regards to inbounding specific stock, specific SKUs into specific markets to maybe meet expected or forecasted demand based on some of those cultural nuances and differences across the board. But yeah, pan EU is a great thing, because you're not managing multiple stock holdings.
That sounds and I know Amazon, again, to your point earlier about there's been a lot of investments that have made there, and certainly I very rarely come across kind of well, compared to what I used to hear anyway, the challenges of moving stock and all of that.
Yeah.
So Amazon's really lifted the game there. But having said that, just to play a little bit of devil's advocate here, right? There are still some local specific challenges that remain, right? Like compliance, customs challenges. Jake, how do you navigate through those? What are the key ones, and how do you navigate through those?
Yeah, so there's a few key things that you've got to plan for and get it set in place. The first one's VAT. So Amazon and different tax partners and the EU legislation have made it a lot easier to manage your VAT. But you do need to be VAT registered in each individual country that you're going to store stock. So for Pan EU, that can be up to 7 countries, I think, now where they store the stock, maybe even more than that now. So you need to have VAT registrations there. So that's the first one. Again, all of this is facilitated by really strong partners. Like, we work with really strong partners. Amazon provide a lot of really strong partners who can help do this, so they can manage the VAT applications for you and the VAT filing. So it's just the case of paying a fee and it's done. And a lot of the time, Amazon will co-fund some of these processes to get people on board. So that's the VAT thing. Customs wise, you need an EORI number, which is just effectively an ID number that businesses require for bringing stock into Europe. So that's something you have to apply for. That one's super easy, so you don't really need anyone to help with that, but it's just something that needs to be done. The note on that is both those things, again, EU, UK separately, so that's just something to sort of watch out with that. But then beyond that, there are compliance requirements across Europe that I think these are the things that put people off a little bit, and people consider them like, particularly compared to the US, that there's a lot of like compliance overreach. Now, the reality of it is it's not that hard to deal with. So there's 2 in particular that you have to work for anyone coming within in the EU. So there's one called GPSR. So it's about product safety regulation. So it's just about having a EU responsible person for that product and for the entirety of its lifeline, and then some requirements around traceability, supply chain traceability, and things like that. Again, it's not very hard to do. Partners can help you report the information that you've got in the there's portals to sort of submit all this stuff, and it's just about them having somebody who can provide this information and can act on behalf of the brand if ever there is something like a recall, etc. And then the other one, sort of in that vein, is called EPR. So EPR is EU policy around end of life management for products. So like packaging, or if it's electronic waste, the batteries and things like that. So what you have to do is report on the amount of waste you're putting into the market, and what you can do with that, and pay a sort of small levy to help deal with that problem. Again, super simple, really. There's providers who do this. You can set up on a portal. Once a year, you go in and you report the number of units you've sold into that market and how much waste that has potentially created, and then they report that to European authorities. It's sort of, on the face of things, like more so, I believe, than what is in the US, but it's nothing that can't really be overcome. All these systems link back into Amazon, so you set up with these providers, they provide the information back into Amazon, or if you're using the right one, they certainly do, to ensure that you're sort of completely compliant and above the board there. So yeah, you're right, Paul. There are some things that still need to be sort of dealt with, but that's the sort of benefit of working with either agencies and then using strong sort of partners within that territory to try and take that headache away from you.
Yeah, I was going to ask that exact follow-up question there, Jake, around of those things that need to be done, compliance, end of life. I've got my whole list here written down. EORI. What can I expect from say a full service Amazon agency versus where do I need to bring in specialized partners?
Yeah, so VAT certainly, bringing in a good tax authority accountants who can help deal with the filings for you is key. As an agency, we're here to advise on all of these pieces. We have the right partners in place who we know work well with Amazon. We know which partners to use to get rebates from Amazon for the costs on this sort of stuff. So it's more about we know which ones are going to work best, because we've tried a lot of them in getting people signed up, and which ones you can use to get a rebate from Amazon, etc. But the agency, you're not going to be responsible for the actual any of this compliance stuff, but we know the people who can help and the ones who are going to work best with Amazon as well.
That makes sense. You haven't touched about advertising yet, and I'd love to just dig a bit deeper into that piece, because obviously we spoke a little bit about fulfillment, we've spoken about local differences, even doing keyword research. the highlighter for me is still 30% pet ownership in France. That's the stat that will forever live with me. Or cat ownership, I should say,
Cats.
not just cat.
Yeah.
I've just got visions of French people living in Parisian apartments with scratching poles for some reason.
Apparently that's what it is.
Um,
They were they're quite ornate. They're like almost like full apartments for the cats and stuff like that.
nice. But what about advertising? I'm interested specifically in two questions. One, efficiency and return versus money spent in other Amazon markets, particularly the US. And then secondly, any differences between markets beyond obviously the language and the keywords you might be bidding? Is there any differences in approach or anything interesting worth considering?
Yeah. So just as a general, and again, it depends on which category, but the US is really mature. It's really competitive. They have some amazing operators over there. They have amazing agencies. Like, everybody's really been in the game that long time. They've refined the advertising. In Europe, some of these territories are still somewhat fairly green. Like, even some of the smaller territories, like, as I said, we talk about Belgium, Netherlands, etc. They're just coming online from an advertising perspective. So as soon as that gap opens, the competition is not as fierce, and the techniques that people are using to get to the top are not as advanced. So there definitely is an advantage on European soil versus US if you can bring that European knowledge over and buy into the US system. In some categories, the CPCs are quite considerably cheaper. So we looked at stuff of one of our clients, operating in the US, top of search bids are at least $2 plus. In France, for argument's sake, it's the equivalent about of $1. So you've got that bit more room to be aggressive, to go after rank if you want to come launch here. Now, again, it's not every single category, but it does, tend to ring true in a lot of places. UK and Germany tend to be a bit more competitive, so quite comparable to the US, but some of the smaller territories where you can actually make quite a good difference on there. And then in terms of like nuances throughout each country, it's the interesting point is in some cases there can be a lot of like really good long tail because of the nature of the language. So in the categories where in the UK we may have like quite concentrated in the top end of keywords that we're going after, meaning CPCs are super high because of the nature of like the language, particularly like German. The particular head words they use in putting the words together, the nuances in that, you get people in Switzerland and people from the Czech Republic and things like that who are searching in a similar sort of way, but on Amazon Germany. It means that in those cases there's loads of long tail that you can go after. So it just means that there's a bit more spread if you've done your keyword research and actually like trying to go after the right terms. You've got like a nice spread of terms to be attacking. So it does that can help, particularly in if you're in a super competitive category where the top end's expensive to break in. It does give you a few more options to sort of move out. But yeah, I think the main thing is like for US brands, if you're coming over, is not to just think it's like, as I said before, it's not one size fits all. You've got to be really looking in depth at each of these different territories to understand what's going on.
That's such an interesting insight about the depth of the keywords and how people search and the differences between someone like the UK and others. I thought people in Britain would be the most eloquent, but clearly they're very efficient shoppers at the same time. So that's super interesting. I want to go back to some of the practical questions around inventory. Right. So we've got this pan-EU model. You mentioned it before, Mark, but we've got to start somewhere, right? So if I'm a brand and maybe I'm thinking like, probably not going to be shipping anything from the US. I'm going to ask my factory in China to probably ship it straight into the UK. How do you advise those brands on the inventory strategy? Where do they start? Where do they go next as they expand? What does a good roadmap look like?
Well, I think obviously the first point, if we've got to that stage with you, we've obviously done an in-depth audit and we're looking where that potential volume exists and an idea of the size of the market. That's the first point. And obviously, despite having done this numerous times, with any new client, we need to test how things work. If we haven't worked with their factory before, how does their factory work? You know, that whole piece to make sure everything's as smooth as possible, so there's no issue. So we would always err on the side of caution. Maybe that's the Britishness in us. I'm not sure, but you know, there's no need to sort of you know run before you can walk, to use an expression. But going back to the AGL bit, you know, remember we're talking about, you know, it's not just full container loads, it's LCL shipments as well, so small parcels. So obviously you need to send in enough stock to give yourself enough coverage across that network on the Pan EU program, but you don't have to send in loads. So, you know, the message that we're putting across is, you know, start smart. Obviously, in the case where the client has completed all their VAT filings and everything, you know, they're ready to have their stock distributed across the network. You know, start small, test, you know, monitor the economics in each of those territories, because as you know, going back to the advertising again, there are differences between CPCs, etc. So there will be differences in conversion. You know, you might be having to refine your content to improve your conversion rate in Italy, let's say, whereas in Germany, you know, that's really good. So, you know, you need to understand all of that. So we, you know, the first, you know, period, you know, to be defined is, you know, very exploratory, a very cautious, and, you know, slowly but surely, hopefully, you know, proving the business case and building the volumes, the rate of sales across the network to get into a position whereby we can start sending in full container loads. We can start thinking about there's a specific promotion in Spain, or going back to those cultural nuances. We're seeing, you know, we're selling cat scratchers. We're always going to remember that now. Cat scratchers in France, and we want to send some stock in directly into France, let's say. So it's really just, you know, thinking about it cautiously, making sure we're on top of the numbers, and, you know, letting the data tell us, you know, where to go and what to do, and you know, prove the business case, if you like.
Yeah, certainly the days of sending in container loads because we are bullish about the sales are over. I do remember some, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago at Prosper, meeting some sellers that would fit that category. Very wise advice, Mark. Thanks for that. I want to get to maybe a question I've been thinking about, but I've deliberately been holding off because I wanted to sort of hear about some of the other facets here. But probably the only question that really counts, at least in the mind of an Amazon brand owner in the US, and maybe I'm being a little bit unfair, I apologize for those US friends who'll be watching this on demand after, but let's talk about profitability. Jake, I would love it if you could share some examples of how Europe has delivered perhaps better margins for US clients. I mean, it's very hard. It's easy to drive sales in the US. It's really hard to drive dollars into the bank account, particularly on Amazon in the US. What's the story in Europe? And
so there's a few examples. I mean, the obvious one that we touched on at the beginning is, you know, a lot of these, depending on which category, and you're zero rated coming into that. So we were speaking with a US client recently. They do make some beauty products in China at the moment. That's 27%. With Trump's new tariff, that's 127%. The equivalent in Europe is zero rated. So off the bat, obviously, that's sort of the hot topic of this. You've not got that problem. The other bit I think is quite interesting. Like, again, there is, again, because of the different countries and you know, different shopping habits, there can be a bit of difference in pricing, and in some cases it can be higher within Europe. So we were looking at a US client, and they were doing the supplement space. They were looking at vitamin C. So the best selling vitamin C in US at the moment is probably about $9. In Germany, for example, is about 5% higher, and that's even when you take into consideration, you know, we include VAT at source and whatnot here. So depending on which category, there is some potential sort of improvements from a price perspective that you can take. Like, if there's a way to premiumize your product and go into categories that make sense, there's some potential wins there. The other interesting one, I think, like, we've had other people in the past come and we've discussed, and is because if you're a US brand, you've not really dealt with your distribution right in the US, and you could have lots of grey market resellers on your list, and they're like suppressing the price, pushing the buy box down. You've not managed that process right. It can be obviously a real headache in the US. But then when those brands tend to come to Europe, they've not got those same issues. The people in the territories over here haven't got the stock available to them, so they've kind of got an open market for them to rebase the price of where they actually want it to be and make the margin back. So we've seen that happen before. It's particularly like in the toy category, it's quite interesting where US is just like turned into a bit of a free for all, and then Europe was just a nice new place for them. So when you sort of take into account that, there's those few areas, if you've got lower CPCs, you're managing to charge potentially a little bit more depending on where you are. You've got freedom in the buy box. There's also, depending on countries as well, there's nuances in return rates, so sometimes that can save some people. UK and Germany are generally like pretty similar to US, but France, Italy, Spain tend to be slightly less. So there's some improvements there. So yeah, there's definitely some opportunity that again make it a bit more interesting for US brands.
Yeah, certainly in the current context, you can almost look at the US P&L, and you can look at different line items and go, right, that's going to be more favorable. That's going to be more favorable. That's going to be, and you add it all up, it does flow to the bottom line.
Yeah.
Great. We are over time, so I'm gonna ask you the last question here. And that is really like, I know a lot of US brands probably were tuning into this later because I'm looking at the time and they go, most of them are still sleeping right now.
Sure.
But for any of them that are going to be watching this later on, on demand and afterwards, and they want to really explore this topic with both of you, what is the best way of getting in touch with you, Jake and Mark?
I think it's always good. Connect with us on LinkedIn. We're always open for a chat with anyone. It doesn't have to be, a hard sales conversation or anything like that. We just always like to meet Amazon sellers, brands, no matter how big or small they are, understand, have a chat with people in the ecosystem. So, drop us a connection request on LinkedIn, send us a message, and we're always up for talking.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Jake, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your insights, being generous. Thank you for, I've written down various notes here and stats. Thank you for those very interesting ones, I must say. I'm not a cat owner, but maybe I should be. I really appreciate it. All the best for Q4, and look forward to having you guys again.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
All the best to you.
Take care. All right, everyone. That is a wrap of today's live session. If you join us live, thank you for being part of it. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out to us after the show. As Mark and Jake said, just drop them a message on LinkedIn, and I'm sure they'd love to follow up with you. If you have registered as well and you've managed to miss part of it, don't worry. We'll send you the full recording so you can revisit the key takeouts anytime. Now, before I sign off, just a quick reminder that Luke and I will be at Unboxed in Nashville in early November. I think it's 10 to the 12th of November. So if you are heading to Nashville, please come and say hello. I'd love to catch up in person. And don't forget, Amazon Vendor Summit is happening on the 9th and the 10th of December. It's free for vendors and Merchant Spring clients, and early bird registration is now open. So head to merchantspring.io, go to upcoming events, and you'll find it right there. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore ideas and strategies that really help brands and agencies thrive on Amazon and beyond. Until next time, my name is Paul Sonneveld, and this has been Marketplace Masters. Take care.